From looking at crypto, everything's very indexed on financial use cases. Kind of the payments use cases is kind of how I abstract it, and there's a lot of market fit there. I always kind of looked at the web as this more data infrastructure level set of web services that aren't kind of strictly financial. People are always going to need some form of non-permanent like data in some way, and typically also within the same application. So the goal is, again, how do we build a unified layer where a whole application can live on top of Irys, which means supporting both use cases, right?
Disclosure, Sami and I are both angel investors in Josh's fantastic data storage and Provenance company, Irys. So anything we say may or may not be biased.
Yeah, you made the terrible mistake of investing in Irys.
I know. He forced me. Like,
I hope not.
I got tricked into investing.
Yeah.
I was coerced.
Correct. That's exactly that's how I get all my investment. I just coerce people. That's exactly how we do it.
Yeah. No one knows how he does it, but he does it. But Josh, you and your Twitter, man, you're one of my favorite founders on Twitter because you tweet often and you are not afraid to ruffle feathers and put some like more out there takes on Twitter. So I'd love to see that. Like, what do you see as the value of Twitter to you and your brand and Irys? And what are your thoughts about like getting, writing out there in public?
Yeah. So anyone who's known me for a few years has basically seen that I've been very quiet for the majority of my time as a founder. And I would say that's been one of my biggest mistakes by miles. And why? Because one is just having good writing skills, which you can only develop through writing, is the number one skill, I think, for anyone. And it's actually now something that we look for with everyone that we hire. Maybe not engineers and things like that, but even there's actually every role I can argue that writing is a very important thing. But to talk about it from a founder's perspective, the number one thing for a founder, there are different ways to abstract it, right? But whether it's hiring, raising capital, those kind of core like CEO, founder things, if you're able to tell a really good story, you'll be able to do all of those things very well. And writing is just the best way to tell a story, in my opinion. And over time, as you write more and more and more, your story becomes better and better. So I think that's kind of that's why writing's so important as a skill. I think I used to think that I was like sharing secret information in some way by writing. I don't want people to know how I think in some way, but that's actually the most immature and can be actually quite stupid perspective. Because even if you expose parts of your strategy early on, you don't realize how much executional risk there is, such that even if someone has your entire playbook and strategy, they will not be able to execute it as well as you do. And I think there are plenty of examples of this in the early stages of Monad, etc. Like you can try and get interns and things like that, but are you going to be able to copy Monad one for one? You'll very much struggle to do so. So it was just I just kind of realized in order for us to succeed, I need to get my thoughts onto paper. Yeah, obviously crypto, it's got to be onto Twitter.
I mean, great answer. You covered like the upside of it and that the downside isn't as bad as people often think. So yeah, I think that makes sense. I'm obviously a big Twitter poster as well. I think it's very valuable just career-wise and just fun, honestly, to engage there. I want to talk very briefly about your background. Normally we don't go too much into background, but yours is unique in the sense you dropped out of uni to found Bundlr, which is now Irys. So just want to hear a little bit about like what motivated you to take that big of a leap against the societal path of like go to college, graduate.
Yeah, I mean, so I dropped out when I was 19. I was just in the first 8 weeks of my second year of university. But I think if I really zoomed out, I kind of always knew that I wanted to do something mathsy, computer sciencey when I was even in my younger teenage years, and I also kind of knew that I wanted to have my own business. I love the idea of having kind of that autonomy in some way. I think autonomy is like one of my big personal drivers. I also have a brother who runs a business who's been very successful. And I think I saw that as well. And I was kind of genuinely inspired. So, and at the fact that I kind of hated school, it's not that I was kind of bad at school in any way. I just didn't like sitting around and spending a bunch of time in school. I I actually really loved maths and computer science. I am a total nerd. So, and I had to study a bunch of stuff that wasn't maths and computer science. So when I got to the point of being able to just study those things, that's when I really started to like school. But yeah, anyway, so got into university, started, kind of got into crypto, and I started what was called Bundlr back then. And the story there is it just kind of took off, and Bundlr was essentially a scaling solution L2 for Arweave. And we launched with Metaplex, which was basically Solana Labs at the time, which is, and Metaplex was Solana's biggest bit of NFT infrastructure. And it was based, we launched August 2021, which is when NFTs went absolutely kind of hyperbolic, so to speak. And yeah, it was just like a no-brainer. I dropped out a few months later because we had so much adoption. We'd reached 99% of Arweave transactions, went from 0 to 1 million transactions within a few months. And I've never raised capital before, and I hadn't raised capital at the time, but I for some reason had this kind of almost like dumb conviction that we'd be able to work it out in some way. So I dropped out at that moment, and I haven't regretted it so far.
Uni is rubbish. All of it's rubbish.
TLDR is uni. I found uni pretty boring overall, yeah. And it was during COVID, right, as well. So it was just double boring.
So Josh, like you said, Bundlr started out as a L2 solution for Arweave. Now you've, I guess, changed the name. It's called Irys, and it's its own layer 1. So can you just quickly talk about that transition? Like, why did you feel the need to launch your own L1? What's different in Irys compared to V1 of Bundlr?
Yeah, I mean, tons of things. So in terms of what we're doing and why we're doing it. So the original reason I got into this side of the space, by this side of the space, I mean the initial kind of data chain space. So I discovered these chains back in kind of late 2020. So Arweave, Filecoin, Sia Store, even Chia back then. And I kind of built conviction around two end games. One really tied to the messaging that these chains had at the time, specifically Filecoin Arweave, where they are essentially trying to protect humanity's information in some way, or become kind of some type of source of truth for humanity's most important information. And that kind of message just kind of hit home for me. And then the second kind of utilitarian perspective that I had with these networks that I kind of built conviction on over time is kind of from looking at crypto, everything's very indexed on financial use cases. Kind of the payments use cases is kind of how I abstract it, and there's a lot of market fit there. But I always kind of looked at the web as this more data infrastructure level kind of set of web services that aren't kind of strictly financial. And the question was kind of how would you bring those services on chain? Because that's a very kind of different domain of problem. And my simple view back then was data is a foundation for these services. Therefore, these data chains would become the foundation for those kind of web services. So even when I talk about the vision for Irys now, it's kind of just, if we can bring more web services on chain over time, then we are succeeding. And then at some point we'll reach kind of some inflection point. So that's kind of the what that's driving me for a while. So initially we started as the L2 on Arweave, scaled that to, from 10,000 transactions a day to 15 million a day at our peak. And then, just recently launched the L1. And as to why we are launching the L1, so Irys is the first programmable data chain. Well, it's really just an extension of that original vision, which is that how can we bring more web services on chain? And to give the very high level of what we mean by programmable data chain to really kind of hit this home is how can we build a unified layer that enables applications that rely on data to operate and scale? So how can we have a layer which enables like large amounts of storage, compute, and also interact with smart contracts and host liquidity and kind of handle the smart contract rules in the general sense. So that's kind of the very kind of high level signpost.
Yeah, I just want to say it's super impressive to your point that Irys at its peak was, I think, doing something like 90% of like all transactions or like data that was being stored higher, on Arweave. So that just goes to show, like, I guess, the scalability or performance of the chain. So hats off to you guys for that. So Connor and I, we're both investors, right? We're both super bullish on Irys, but I want to pose some let me cosplay as a bear right now. So if somebody came to you and was like, okay, this kind of sounds like Filecoin now that it has its FEM, how do you respond?
Yeah, I mean, this is a really good question, and I'll outline this as clearly as possible. I'll also reference to conversations that I've had with people at Protocol Labs, who are also no longer there as well. I've spoken to a lot of people. So we're taking two very fundamentally different approaches. So the way I talk about Filecoin is that it's essentially a temporary data chain where it focuses on providing, at its core kind of consensus level, temporary storage using these storage deals, using ZK and storage deals. And then it has this integrated FEM, which is the Filecoin virtual machine, which enables you to do programmatic deals, essentially. So a deal is really just represents, I want to store 64 gigabytes of data for usually for I think it's 2.5, 3 years or something like that. Don't quote me, but some number of years, short number of years. And, it just gets published to the marketplace, and a miner essentially accepts it or doesn't accept it, and then chooses to store the information. And then the FEM is like, okay, how can we create things like perpetual storage where we can glue these deals together to make kind of longer term storage and stuff like that. So it's not really programmability at the data layer, it's programmability at this deal layer. So my fundamental argument is that functionality is useful, but not that useful. And it won't lead to some kind of degree of mass adoption. Where the utility really lies, and why we call ourselves programmable data chain, is we enable programmable data, which is that, okay, you can store data that's useful. It's a commodity, so not useful at scale. But when you make data useful, when you make it programmable, when you can do things with it, so to speak, that's when you see these interesting use cases come out. So the idea, technically, the technical difference is that with Irys, you can actually do things with the data within the VM.
Yeah.
And the way I can kind of go into the technicals of why we can do that or how we do that, but the general idea is that, and the goal for how we design this moving forward as well, is that how can we just extend the programmability? How can we enable more and more net new functionality at the base layer as well? So you might see me write about this on Twitter, but I'm very anti-fragmentation. I'm not bearish on L2s. I think you eventually have to have L2s, but if you go with an L2 first approach, you will fail. It's my typical approach. So how can we, this is why I talk about it as a unified layer. I don't like fragmentation. You'll hear me say these kind of similar concepts. It's all about how can we enable more utility for the actual data at the base layer.
I actually love the way that you described it, where Filecoin is focused on programmable deals. They don't really do anything at the actual data level, where Irys can actually enable programmability with the data itself. And I think that's people might view that as a minor detail, but it's day and night in terms of functionality and what you can do with that data. So love that explanation. You guys are obviously also trying to, incentivize builders to come deploy or build on Irys, right? So why would some, let's say, Deepin project choose to do that versus just using Irys to store their data? Launching on whether Solana or IoTex, and then almost using, Irys as a traditional storage provider.
Yeah. So the answer is multi-dimensional. I would say one, there will be people who just use us for storage, and there will be also protocols, there'll be tokens on Irys, there'll be kind of a whole ecosystem there. So I think we don't bias against any use case. We will have a combination of both. In terms of why we would have native protocols launch on us, when we talk about what are the killer apps, what do we optimize for? We're really optimized for applications that rely on data to operate and scale. It's not the sexiest way of putting it, but the idea is that how can we support applications that have large amounts of data, need to compute on that, want to do that within a VM as well, and also want to host kind of liquidity or smart contract rules in some way. So that might not be all Deepin networks, but there are definitely a bunch of Deepin networks that are very kind of data heavy. So my favorite one that I tweeted about recently, which I was talking about, is the Grass use case, for example. I mostly talk about Grass because they're an example of a chain which, at least from an investor standpoint, has pretty good market fit. And so for anyone listening, Grass is essentially a Deepin network, which monetizes your bandwidth, but what essentially is happening is that you have a browser extension, you're scraping the internet and you're sending it to Grass, and they're aggregating your data and they're selling that to people, and you make the revenue. So the idea is that that kind of stack is a combination of having a bunch of storage, being able to compute with that, defining monetary policy within smart contracts that relate to the data as well. And the goal is like, how can we make building that kind of application fully on chain as easy as possible? Because even now, the Grass is like mostly very off chain. And the goal is like, how can we make the cost of doing that on chain, both from a actually functional kind of cost of using the service, but also the cost of actually developing, basically make that 10 to 0. So that's kind of the core pitch to a lot of these Deepin networks that want to build these protocols fully on chain.
For sure. Yeah, I saw that thread. It's a good thread. Glad you guys are in touch with them as well. I mean, it would be great if they built on Irys. And I think they're one of the most hyped Deepins in terms of being pre-TGE and this whole crazy points program. And they've done a really good job of just like growing their community and their supply side. I think they're like 2-3 million contributors probably at this point. So I'm eagerly awaiting the Grass airdrop as well.
I mean, yeah. So go.
Who isn't, right? I know Sami is too. Talking about Deepin maybe broadly on the whole, just given this is a Deepin focused podcast, like what excites you about Deepin, Josh? Like how bullish are you on a scale of 1 to 10? You know, what do you think about the industry as a whole?
I mean, 10 on the low end. My view on Deepin is actually that it's one of the verticals that actually have the most market fit, but the least hype, weirdly. It's like the total, I would say it's the opposite of AI right now, where I think there are parts, it's opposite of AI more generally, where like there's a lot of AI which is like not very focused. And I think the kind of Sami that in the Tau subnets, like there are definitely some. No, I read Sami's. I think I read Sami's deck, and now I believe that Tau subnets are actually building a bunch of real shit. But
thank God,
that's good.
yeah. But it's a very kind of a contrast, and it's very clear with things like Helium that there are actually Deepin networks that make a ton of money, and even early stage. I remember when I was speaking to the founder of Grass when he had just raised his first round from Polychain, which was now over a year ago, and even then he was making like pretty okay money compared to some of these compared to Polkadot and some of these like multi-billion-dollar protocols. So it's kind of clear that these Deepin networks are, one, reducing the cost of bootstrapping these networks by literal like orders and orders of magnitude. They also have way more reach when you think about Helium's, the fact Helium can actually help some of these existing carriers because they have reach into these different areas, and they can do so at a super low cost. So it's clearly a proven use case. And then the demand for these networks is actually way higher than any other category, really. So it just seems like the most fundamental based vertical, probably after DeFi at this point.
Yeah, I mean, what I loved about Deepins is, like, to your point, they're tapping into the much larger market, which is Web 2. And I think that's kind of what's interesting with Irys as well, where like initially it was just permanent storage, which really was only appealing to a lot of like on-chain use cases, whereas like just this concept of permanent storage I think could be really helpful for like traditional companies, but like it was just difficult for people to wrap their head around. And so like contract-based storage or temporary storage was a lot more digestible. And so is that how you would you argue that like this was the reason why you guys added like contract-based storage within Irys, which was to like go after not just the on-chain economy, but also like this off-chain Web 2 economy?
So I'm gonna provide a counterpoint here, and actually say the answer is no. I think people should be aware of some companies going after Web 2, especially with commodity-based services that already exist. So I think Filecoin went after enterprise for a long time, and it clearly didn't work. There are also a bunch of reasons it didn't work. I think it's very easy to look at something like Filecoin and be like, okay, well, they failed. Like, therefore, all temporary storage fails in Web3. I don't think that's quite true. But I think it's generally hard to compete because all they really care about is cost. They don't care about these verifiability things and stuff like that. So Web2 companies care less. In terms of why we did it, is essentially it comes back to the idea of building this unified layer. Applications need both. Like sometimes they need permanent data, and I am still very bullish that in 10 years time, like we'll laugh at the fact that we didn't think this thing had demand. It's probably going to be billions and billions and billions of dollars of revenue. But also people are always going to need some form of like data in some way, and typically also within the same application. So the goal is, again, how do we build a unified layer where a whole application can live on top of Irys, which means supporting both use cases, right?
We only had a couple minutes left. Can you share anything about when token, what it'll be used for? Any projects you're like thinking you're kind of modeling the tokenomics off of?
My favorite question I get on Twitter every day.
Yeah.
Yeah. So when token, I obviously can't answer, but in terms of like what the timeline is for us, so we're basically at the point of a closed testnet. So we're getting people to build native apps on it, et cetera, et cetera. You can store data, that kind of stuff. And then next will be public testnet, and then thereafter would be mainnet. That's kind of the order of events. And in terms of the tokenomics, it's going to be a very typical like Deepin-y looking tokenomics where there'll be some kind of inflation curve, and those will be allocated to people providing capacity on the network in some way. But I think to talk about how this is different is we have a lot of lessons learned from the existing protocols. I think I actually must sound like I hate Filecoin, but I'm going to use them as an example of bad tokenomics, and I don't have that bad of an opinion, but they printed a huge amount. They had a huge amount of inflation in the first few years, and it absolutely wrecked a lot of miners at the end of the day. And there are also some other issues there, and it just makes it very difficult to attract people to the ecosystem. And yeah, our goal is how do we not scare people away with a kind of a terrifying inflation curve, where miners are going to struggle to be profitable on a 3 to 5 year time horizon. So again, you're only as strong as your community, and then that does also come down to tokenomics to some greater or less degree.
For sure. Lesson of the day: don't dump on your community. All right, with that, Josh, we will wrap here. We've got the next guy in the lobby. But thank you so much for coming on, man. This was awesome. Been in the works for a bit. Great to have Sami back on as well. Miss him. He's my co-host.
Miss you too, Connor.
And yeah, I'll talk to you guys soon.
I appreciate it, guys. Thank you.
It was a pleasure chatting, Josh, even though you piss me off sometimes, but I love you, bro.
Thanks for listening to the Proof of Coverage podcast. We post new episodes Mondays and Wednesdays, interviewing the best Deepin and crypto founders out there. If you like this episode, follow us on Twitter at CoverageProved and all other platforms, including YouTube and Spotify, at Proof of Coverage Podcast. Thank you.